everybody. My name is Ariana King. I am the marketing coordinator here at Meetup. This is our 12th installment of Dismantling Social Injustice series. You may have joined us for one of our previous events in the series where we've covered issues such as mental health, urban policy, equal and civil rights for the transgender community. If so, welcome back. And if this is your first time with us, welcome and thank you for joining us for this conversation. Our goal is to continue fostering important dialogue through events like these. In today's installment, we'll be discussing intersectionality, a coined term by legal scholar Kimberlé Crenshaw more than 30 years ago. Special guests Aurora Higgs and Paul Brown Tucker will discuss the origins of intersectionality and why it's a useful framework for understanding discrimination and how organizations are using intersectional approaches to combat inequality. Learn how you can apply these principles and make progress towards a more equitable and just society. So before we get into the meat of things, I do just want to go over some quick event guidelines. Just so you know, this event is recorded. However, you will not appear in video, so you don't have to worry about that. You are courtesy muted, so you don't have to worry about accidentally turning on your volume. Everything is completely quiet, private, and we do want to hear from you. We want this to be an interactive experience. So if you have questions, you can submit them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we will have an opportunity to answer some of those a little bit later on. Additionally, closed captioning is available. To turn it on, click the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. It'll be in the same section with the Q&A. Quickly, we'll go over our agenda. So I'm going to finish up this introduction and you can get to know us a little better. And then we'll start the panel discussion with Aurora and Paul. Lastly, we'll have the Q&A where you guys can ask some of the questions that maybe you had coming in or might arise while you're listening to the discussion. We'll go ahead and turn that off so that we can actually see more of us. I want to give our panelists a chance to introduce themselves. So Aurora, would you like to go first?
Sure thing. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Aurora Higgs. My pronouns are she, her, and they, them. I am a Black non-binary trans femme in Richmond, Virginia. I am a diversity, equity, inclusion, and empowerment consultant, as well as activist in my area. I also work for a local LGBT community center here where I'm the program director. Super happy to be here, and it is such an honor to have this conversation among all of you.
We are very happy to have you. Thank you so much for joining us. Paul, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Ariana. Thanks, Aurora. Hello, everyone. Wonderful to be here. My name is Paul Brown Tucker. I use he, him, his pronouns. I am a light-skinned Black gay man who has been doing diversity and inclusion work for 17 years. I currently serve as Diversity and Inclusion Program Manager at Act Blue, and I also serve as an advisor to the RISE Journey, focusing on racial equity. My background is really, I'm excited about this topic today because my background is centered in intersectionality and Black feminist thought in particular. So really excited to talk with Aurora and to all of you, and Ariana as well. So, okay, looking forward to it.
And we are very excited to have you. So we are going to jump into it. So firstly, in order to make sure that everybody participating right now is on the same page about what we're really talking about, can we start by defining intersectionality and where its strengths and assets lie?
Paul, do you have a preference? I can go.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so intersectionality is the idea that none of us come to the table as a monolith, and a monolith meaning, you know, just everything is cut and dry and you're a single story. Rather, many of us, when we talk about identities, you know, whether it be your sexual orientation, whether it be your race or your citizenship status, all of these are different identities, and none of us are just one of these. No one among us is just Black. Some of us are Black men, some of us are Black women, some of us are Black and non-binary or transgender. And so intersectionality recognizes the sum total ways that we are individuals, but more importantly than that, it also recognizes how oppression can interact on a number of our different identities, especially if those identities are marginalized. So if I'm a Black trans woman, that doesn't mean that I only experience racism or only experience transphobia. I'm experience both, and they actually multiply against each other to make a type of oppression that is more than just the sum of its parts. So the best way that I tell people is that it's a framework of analysis for us to really grapple with the complexity that is humanity and the oppressions that face us.
Thank you so much for that really comprehensive breakdown of it. Paul, do you have anything that you'd like to share or elaborate on?
Sure, yeah, just building on what Aurora said, it definitely is a really great framework of analysis and really looking at all of these issues. To give some additional context, my background is really looking at the intersectionality of race, class, and gender, and how those impact folks have historically and how they do in the present day. But there's, as Aurora mentioned, there's intersectionality covers all of the aspects of our identities. And so it's important to keep that in mind, and really helps to get to, in terms of thinking about the strengths of this approach, this particular framework of analysis, it really allows us to get to the complexity with which issues like racism and sexism and a whole host of things impact groups at a number of levels and individuals at a number of levels. So it's really, really powerful in that way as we think about it gets to the particularities.
Yeah, I think the complexity is something that's really key. It's realizing how many different things go into how we experience the world. So in trying to understand intersectionality and how it is specifically a framework of analysis, sometimes other schools of thoughts are sort of like mashed into the concept of intersectionality. Can we also talk a little bit about what intersectionality is not? So we're really getting specific about what it is. Paul, do you want to jump in first on this one?
Sure. And we may talk about this later, but I think one of the things that's important to highlight, particularly acknowledging the moment where we are as a country and just the backlash we're seeing with another framework of analysis, thinking particularly about critical race theory. So intersectionality has like connections to and relationship with some of the founders of critical race theory were also a part of the sort of founding or the conceptual development of intersectionality as its sort of scholarly academic analysis or study. So, but it's important to note that they're not necessarily the same thing. There is some overlap, but that's important to keep in mind. I think just in general, lots of things are lumped in with intersectionality. You know, Aurora and I both do diversity and inclusion work on a regular, and so again, there's overlap. But just because people in companies and organizations, I would argue, are doing diversity and inclusion work doesn't necessarily mean that they're using an intersectional lens or that particular framework of analysis to engage in the actual work. So I think it's important to, even though it may seem like these are all one and the same, in practice, it really plays out differently. So that's important to highlight.
Thank you. Aurora, did you have anything to add on sort of this question of confusion and commingling of thoughts?
Yeah, one thing that I've seen with intersectionality is that there is this idea that intersectionality is solely for the purpose of recognizing that we are all actually diverse people and diverse individuals. And we are. And intersectionality does give us a framework to sort of self-analyze how we ourselves are individuals and not just, no one is just white and no one is just a woman. We have other things that we bring to the table, and no one's set of intersections really look like ours in that way. And so one thing, intersectionality, a really interesting trapping that I've seen is that people will tend to kind of engage in this oppression Olympics and say, well, I can't be racist or I can't be ableist, and because I'm a diverse person and I understand what marginalization and oppression is. And even for me, intersectionality does not give me a free pass to say, oh, well, I'm a minority and I'm all these different intersections of minority. And so therefore, I don't have anything left to learn when it comes to diversity and inclusion. I find a lot of people using that, this idea of like, well, if I'm diverse, then I already know diversity. Diversity is me and I am diversity. Therefore, I have nothing else to learn and no ways to strengthen that practice. But I would say, in fact, when you look at it outside of just ourselves and that sort of self-centered thinking, when you look at it at a policy or an institutional level, and you see how there are certain public services out there that might be claimed to be diverse, but is leaving out maybe undocumented people, or maybe leaving out people of color who also are at the intersection of being low socioeconomic status. And so what it should be is a way for us to look at and find problems or gaps in equity, but what it's not is a way for us to pat ourselves on the back for being and living diversity. I think it's great for that, but we can't just crawl with it, we have to run with it. And if we're running with it, then we're experiencing the full breadth of what that concept is.
Yeah. I have a love-hate relationship with that term, oppression Olympics, because it's sad that it exists, but it's so true very often that people will sort of hide behind elements of their identity to make it so they don't have to do the hard work of, engaging with these conversations. Paul, it sounded like you were going to say something, but I'm going to throw the next question at you while you give me this response.
Yep.
So in addition to confusion, there's also some flat out negativity when it comes to discussing intersectionality. And honestly, for me, it seems confusing because, as we've established so far, it's a framework of analysis. So it doesn't really put anything in, it doesn't really take anything away, it just examines what exists. Why does this negativity and pushback exist around intersectional thinking and analysis?
That's a great question, and I think it does fit into what I was going to share, because embedded in intersectionality, to really do the work that Aurora had mentioned, is a level of positionality, which is an acknowledgement of power dynamics and privilege and oppression in a really explicit way. Intersectionality allows us to position ourselves within all of the different hierarchies that we have created, the hierarchy of human value, and its many manifestations, whether it be about race, whether it be about gender, whether it be about any other number of things. So there is pushback and frustration and resistance to this, because intersectionality and positionality really call out those elements of power and privilege and oppression. And we are, as a nation, since our founding, since before the Declaration of Independence, before, like, really in the early days, but obviously up until now, we have wrestled with the question of who we are as a nation. And there, you see a lot with, particularly with respect to critical race theory, there's a big pushback, and people are really concerned about children being taught a history that implicates them. And the reality is that we are all implicated. I think Isabel Wilkerson, who wrote the book Caste, used a great analogy in the example of the old house that she lived in. She wasn't responsible for, the shoddy craftsmanship, and now the walls are bowed and the roof is caving in, and there's water damage over here, but it's the house that she bought, the house that she lives in, whether or not she wants to hem and haw all day long about, I didn't do this. This is the work that needs to be done if she is to live in this house. If it's going to stand and withhold her, and be a place where she can find shelter. So similarly, she uses that analogy to speak of the US and saying that like none of us who are here today were necessarily responsible for the way in which this country was founded. And yet we all live here and the country was founded and the walls are bowing, the roof is caving in and there's water damage. And we can't ignore that or the house will cave in on us. But we have a history that suggests like, oh, just throw some wallpaper. We threw wallpaper up. It's beautiful. This is, you know, like there was nothing ever wrong here, or nothing ever bad, which is not the case. So I think that's really where some confusion, where some pushback comes from.
That is an analogy I've never heard, but it's so poignant and spot on. It's just, you know, a lot of blame shifting and wallpapering. Wow, like that just kind of hit the nail on the head with how things have been functioning, and also, you know, what needs to be done. Some serious construction, demolition, and rebuilding. Aurora, can you shed a little bit more light on why this negative outlook on intersectionality exists?
Yeah, and I second what Ariana said, and that Paul really hit the nail on the head in that critical race theory and intersectionality and these anti-racist frameworks of analyses that we use, they're not meant to place blame necessarily. What they do is trace sources, and sometimes we confuse that with blame. But blame is really when we condemn something, and I don't think that that's what's happening here. We're naming where something came from because we have to admit that sometimes we notice in our culture we have an over-romanticization of our history and how we got to where we are. So much so that we even forget things like who built the railroads and the White House, and whether or not that labor was consensual. And so we know there's so much history and data that tells us that we come from a history and a culture that actually was actively racist and said so and was proud of that. That is where our country comes from, and we have data and narrative that backs that up. That's not us, hyperbolizing anything. That's real. That's a real thing. And I think the more that we really come to terms with the reality of our history, just as Paul was saying, the more that we can kind of go, okay, this is not about blaming white people or blaming rich people or blaming people who have property and own property and have done so generationally for a long time. This is about recognizing how maybe you enjoy something that the rest of the world does not, and that there are very real reasons and mechanisms in our society that keep that moving. And so you can decide in that moment, okay, this is not about me, but I have a stake and I have the ability, maybe more so than others, to fix it or to disrupt it in some way, even in some small way. That is very different than saying, oh, because you've got it good, you're the problem. I don't think any of us on this Zoom chat among the panelists think that the people who enjoy privilege asked for it before they were born. We know that that's not how it happens. No one asks for the life that they've been given. And intersectionality recognizes that people, depending on what they look like or what families they're born into, get very different treatments and life expectancies, sometimes 20 years, the gap. In Richmond, there is Richmond, Virginia, where I live, depending on what neighborhood you were born into and your socioeconomic status and race. So when we look at all three of those, that's in an intersectional analysis. When we look at those, we find that within Richmond City, within 20 miles or something like 20 miles, there's a 20-year gap in life expectancy between groups of people, depending on where you live and your race. So intersectionality gives us the tools to kind of get rid of this overly romanticized idea and tell us that, hey, just like Paul said, we're living in a house that's condemned and it's falling to pieces. And I know we don't want to face that, but unfortunately, we were born into this house. There's nothing we can do about it. There's nothing we can do about how the house came to us, but we can choose to fix it. And yes, it will take work, and it's not fair technically that you have to do this work, but you have to choose if you want to live in that house. And in this analogy, this country and this culture is that house. So I know it's not fair, and I know it's a lot of work, but if we want to live in a nicer house so that our next generations aren't born into a dilapidated, condemned house, then we have to do the work now. And intersectionality gives us the tools to kind of wake up from that romanticized idea. And so I think there's a lot of resistance just because of that, because it's a rude awakening. And I get that, and that's hard, but it is an awakening. It's the reality rather than a dream.
So it's just becoming very clear how impactful and powerful an intersectional analysis can be, because there's just more information that can be gathered when you drill down to different specifics. So I want to know, are there any institutions or organizations that are already implementing an institutional framework, an intersectional framework, and if so, who has done it so far, and what has the impact been?
I'll just say really quickly, yeah, I mean, there are already institutions doing intersectional work. There have always been institutions doing it. Intersectionality, though, was popularized by Kimberlé Crenshaw. She was not the owner of the concept. There are people who are always Black women or Latinx people with disabilities, or however, any different combination of identities you can think of. People like that have always existed. We've always existed. And so we recognize and have always understood that our mixture of oppression, it gets us different treatments. And we know that we're aware of intersectionality, whether or not we have a word for it or not. It's an understanding of how you're treated and what your outcomes are in the world. And so, yeah, there are definitely folks who are doing it, especially organizations that are founded in intersectional missions. So like any organization that is for Black women or Latinx people who are seeking, who are undocumented, or people who have disabilities in our athletes. There are organizations that have always been like that and are inherently intersectional and will continue to be before and after intersectionality as a buzzword. It goes out of style.
Yeah, I agree. There are so many examples historically, but also in the present moment when we think about grassroots organizations and social movements, which a lot of times, as Aurora mentioned, are led by Black women or women of color. And you see this lens of analysis really being implemented and embedded in the mission and carried out through all of the programs and services offered through these various organizations, and as part of the calls for change and advocacy that they are championing. So you see that, I mean, one of the places where you see this in particular is the transformative justice movement. Again, lots of women of color are in this space leading these efforts to not only sort of have restorative relationships and practice restorative justice, but to actually improve the way in which the circumstances that contributed to a particular incident of harm, transform that so that whatever root causes are being addressed in the resolution to this particular instance. And so you see lots of women of color in those spaces. And a lot of times too, I mean, if you look at Black Lives Matter too, there are queer women of color, queer Black women who are leading these efforts. So there's a lot to be learned from these examples, and I'm sure we'll talk about some historical examples as well.
Thank you, guys. And something that sort of strikes me as you're talking about right now, who these people are who have implemented these elements of change. This damaged house that we all communally live in doesn't affect everyone in the same ways. And when you talk about Latinx people who are also undocumented, or queer women of color, it just shows that, you know, the people who are maybe on the more disenfranchised end of a couple of different spectrums are more capable of seeing where our faults lie and where some of the more significant damage is, because they experience it. It's like there are some people who are, you know, on the fresher side where things are still standing, and there are some people who, you know, barely got two walls on a floor. And that's just something that's been popping up as you guys are talking about who is starting organizations and making statements. Aurora, something you mentioned is that Kimberlé Crenshaw did not create the concept of intersectionality. So she's clearly not the first person to introduce the framework. Can you share some more details on what that means and how intersectionality came about as a framework and as, you know, a buzzword?
Yeah, and I will say I loved, Ariana, how you were kind of conceptualizing that, because you're right. It might not be a dilapidated house, but maybe a dilapidated building of apartments where some people in the basement are experiencing much worse, you know, decay than those in the middle or at the top. So I just want to put that out there. I love that you kind of expanded that, because I absolutely agree. And then as far as the popularity of the term, so Kimberlé Crenshaw was a lawyer, is a trained lawyer, is a lawyer still with us. So 30 years ago, really looked at the outcomes of Black women in the justice system and found that they were experiencing something that seemed to be more than just sexism due to their being women and racism due to them being Black. It was something particular about being Black women, because they were experiencing worse outcomes than Black men and white women. And so Kimberlé realized, oh, okay, I see what's happening. It's not a simple addition of oppression, it's a multiplication, if you will. And so, again, Kimberlé really was using, or Dr. Crenshaw, not to be overly familiar, Dr. Crenshaw was really using it to explain what she was seeing in her field. And so, again, this same idea could have another name that's being used in other communities that maybe wasn't as popularized, or maybe didn't happen at the exact time when maybe we were also starting to become more socially aware and progressive. And so you've got people like Bell Hooks, who talked about being a Black woman, and I don't remember her using the word intersectionality. And you've got Audre Lorde, who is Black and queer and a femme. And so you've got Marsha P. Johnson in New York, who is a Black queer femme in New York, who is also transgender. You've got these people who were talking and being very explicit about the differences that they were experiencing because of the multiplication of their identities and the oppressions of that, but they didn't use that word. And so one thing I want to be very clear about is that intersectionality is not a concept that is meant to be just for academics or intellectuals. It's not, no one owns that concept. And even though Dr. Crenshaw introduced it to us in a really popular fashion, it's not her word or her concept. And she focused on Black women. There are other types of intersectionality out there, but what she gave us is a concept that we could use to employ in infinite different scenarios. And so I do want to be very clear too, in that this was, I think it was introduced in 1980, in the early 80s. And so that era was very different than maybe 20 years before that, when we as a society weren't really even interested in this type of like social movement making, or 40 years before that, because, you know, depending on how you look at our country, we've always been in a series of civil rights movements and liberation movements, but there has been a buzz around it that has come around from us as a society wanting to be more progressive and show a more progressive side of us. And so that's a great thing, but as when we get excited or overly excited about things, we tend to kind of overuse them so that they almost lose their meaning a little bit. And so what I don't want is for us to think of intersectionality as this like buzzword that we can just throw around wherever. It is a very powerful tool of analysis. It's very general, but it's very powerful. And I also don't want us to kind of get wrapped up in this idea of like Kimberlé Crenshaw is the maker and ender of this. She used it and gave us a name that we're still using for it, but other communities that are intersectional have also dealt with it and deserve credit for kind of maneuvering in ways that highlight their understanding of it.
Yeah, Aurora, from the very beginning, you said, it's a framework of analysis, which means that once you understand this tool and this concept that individuals and groups and situations are multifaceted, you can use that to more accurately understand so many different situations. And like you said, Kimberlé Crenshaw was talking about Black women when she created the term intersectionality, but intersections don't end at Black women. And even as a Black woman, that is not the end of my, personal set of identities. So framework. It is a lens of analysis to understand things. It's not a label. We can't let it become a buzzword. That is very clear. Paul, can you talk a little bit about the impact that some of these earlier thinkers had based on their intersectional viewpoints? Aurora shared some, but I just wanted to check in with you and see if there were any that were sitting
Sure.
on your head.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, I think real quick to Aurora's point about, Kimberlé Crenshaw, and particularly thinking about the time frame at which she was thinking about these ideas, doing her research. You're also thinking about, relatively speaking, this is new access to higher education in substantial numbers of ways, right? Like there have always been a trickle of folks of color in different institutions across the country, but at the time that she's doing this work, you're seeing more and more folks of color who are in higher education and becoming professors and doing research. So naturally, their questions, their research questions are going to look quite different than other folks. So this is a natural extension and an evolution of that access being opened up for folks. To your point, Ariana, some of the examples that I am thinking about, and really early days of US history, you have someone like Maria Stewart, who was an abolitionist, I want to say in the Northeast, in New England, in Boston more particularly, and she was one of the first women to speak about race and the issue, of slavery and abolition. So you have an example of her. You also have, in very similar ways, Sojourner Truth, who had a famous speech, ain't I a woman, right? Like, everybody, you can see me, I am Black, but ain't I a woman too? And really joining the causes of the abolitionist movement and freedom and dignity for Black folks with women's rights. So you have these really rich examples, in addition to the ones that Aurora shared, that really, for me, stand out. And going to the framework of analysis, like maybe Maria Stewart and Sojourner Truth and these other folks didn't have like, oh, I'm going to call this intersectionality and it's going to be a thing. But they were thinking about it. Like, I'm a woman, but ain't I Black? That's intersectionality at work. In language and at a time that was very specific, but that's still intersectionality. And we can see that in action. So really, again, just another feather in the cap of framework of analysis, and you see where things come together.
Thank you. So many of us are here because some of these are things we knew, some of these are things that we're passionate about. Let's jump to 2021. How do we as a society and individuals move forward. So in our everyday lives, what are things that we can implement to tip the scales just a little bit? Who started last? I think Aurora started last, so Paul, why don't you jump in on this one?
So I will say, I'm really biased. Again, my orientation rather to all of the work of diversity and inclusion is really through race relations. It's through Black feminist thought. It's through intersectionality, particularly at race, class, gender. And I was a part of an undergraduate race relations program at Michigan State University. And the goal of that program was to have conversations, to have weekly dialogue with people across traditional lines of difference, and to build genuine relationships in the community in the process. So for me, relationships are the key way in which we move and drive these things forward. And when we think about intersectionality, again, the framework of analysis, just thinking about these different aspects of our identity, it's easy to think about people in our lives who hold multitudes, because we all do. And my hope is that we live in a very segregated society, and we work in a very segregated ways. So it can be very difficult, especially in this post-pandemic. I don't know if it's really post-pandemic, but in pandemic world, these COVID times, like it can be hard. It was hard before, but it can be hard to develop genuine relationships across difference. But for me, that is one of the most powerful ways, and that's particularly an interpersonal way in which we can create change.
I would say that Paul hinted at something, another kind of framework of analysis, which is this recognition of interpersonal change versus cultural change. And so one thing that I would say in the future, I hope that we adopt the true meaning of intersectionality and the true implications of intersectionality, not just looking at people, but looking at how oppression works. Oppression is just as intersectional as people are, because it works against people. It is always creating new technologies and mechanisms to keep certain people down and keep certain people up. So I want people to know, to create change just in understanding what intersectionality is and what it's not. And so I hope what Paul and I were talking about were resonating and made sense and were clear to people. I would also just say to look at other frameworks of analysis, to look at change. And so Paul was talking about interpersonal change. Well, when we're looking at, sometimes we use intersectionality, excuse me, sometimes we're looking at intersectionality to find gaps in equity in society. And once we find those gaps, we can choose to react to them or to address them. And it really depends on what level that oppression lives in. And so if it lives at the interpersonal level, that has a very particular set of strategies that work really well. So people going through anti-racism trainings as an individual, that's really great interpersonal work. But when we're looking at the policy level, which is one of the most far-reaching levels, we have to do things that are more impactful than anti-racist training. We actually have to create laws that build in things like affirmative action or equity, social justice, reparations, things like that, because those things work at the institutional level, but maybe not at the individual level or at the cultural level. So just a refresher, the levels are personal, which is within yourself, interpersonal, between you and another, cultural, which are all the things that are sort of fluid in our society. Anything, I say things that are not written down or laws or policies, things like behaviors, values, that's cultural. But then you've got institutional. That's all the things that are kind of written and enforced. That's laws, policies, the way we allocate money, all of that. Those, you have to identify where the problem lies before you can attack it. And you can't interchange strategies from one level to the other. That's really important. And I think that gets us in trouble, because when we find that a corporation is doing something very racist or something misogynistic, you can't just force everybody to go through an anti-racism training and be like, oh, done. Like that kind of works at the individual level, but you need something more sustainable and interwoven. So I hope that we recognize that, and I hope we implement more tools of analyses that have intersectionality, Black feminist thought, trans affirming policies. I want us to move forward with more and more tools to collect in our arsenal so that we can kind of, because it's a literal tool belt. Again, if we're living in a dilapidated building, we have to arm ourselves with tools, and we have to work collectively, and each of us take on different tasks to bring the building up to code. And again, that's going to look very different from individual to individual versus, city zoning and all the ways this metaphor can go. I hope that we recognize that it's not about blame, but it is about kind of taking responsibility for what we have been given and trying to make the best of it.
I love that. And so you talked about the multifaceted levels to impacting change. And one of those levels is institutional. For many of us, the institution that we have the most impact with is our place of work. So, what can companies do to adopt intersectional frameworks and make improvements on an immediate way? Or I'm gonna throw that one back at you.
Yeah. So this is where things can kind of get tricky, because it's a really large and prescriptive kind of issue, and you usually have consultants come in and get a lay of the land and figure out what we can do, because company A is very different from company B. But some things that I would say that can help generally, do an analysis of who works within the company and who the company serves externally. And first of all, check and see if those things kind of look one-to-one. If you look and everyone within the company looks very different than the folks that you consider to be your stakeholders, maybe look at that. I'm not saying that there's necessarily something wrong there, but that should be another kind of like, oh, let's look into that and make sure that there's a particular and ethical reason for that. Two, I would say, once you have a lay of the land of who is working internally, ask them what they think. They are the direct stakeholders. What Paul and Ariana were talking about is there are going to be people who are sort of at the bottom of the social hierarchy or the organizational hierarchy who will have very different and very real and valuable feedback on things that they see that people at the top will never see, because that's just, things are compartmentalized like that. And so you have to get a lay of the land from everyone at every single level, and then do an analysis of, okay, here's what we've got, and we have to do something about it. But the first thing that I tell people is don't try to reinvent the wheel. Ask the people what solutions they want to see to the problems that they're seeing too, and take those seriously. I think a lot of us, we know that there's a problem and we ask, but we're kind of hoping we won't get the responses. And when we do, our first thought is, oh, that's too much. But imagine a world where maybe that's not too much, and that you're actually making real efforts to meet people where they're at and realize some of the feedback and manifest that, make that part of the actual mission is serving the people who work for you, and then do the same with the external groups as well. And that's a starting place. That's step zero. There's a lot more work that goes into it, but if you're doing that, chances are you're going to get feedback that everyone else maybe that you're currently asking is too afraid or maybe unable to realize.
You know what I heard in that question? Investment. You need to invest in a consultant. You need to invest time. You need to invest in actually caring. I do want to make sure that we have enough time for questions. So we're going to round this off with the speed round. So can each of you share one resource that might be helpful to an audience member who is interested in learning more, and one initiative that you're currently working on? Paul, ready, set.
Thanks. So one resource I would tell everyone to, it's an article, read it, it's great. It's by Audre Lorde. It's called Age, Race, Class, and Sex, Women Redefining Difference. She talks about all of those issues, again, from an intersectional lens, thinking about her particular experience as a Black feminist who is in an interracial relationship, who is sort of, I think at this point she's older or middle aged, and she has kids, right? So thinking about all of those things, all of those dynamics, what does this mean? So she's really great. She also defines what racism is from her understanding and from her perspective. So that's great. I think one of the things, one of the initiatives I'm working on is I work for an organization at the intersections of tech and politics and the nonprofit space. So really looking at people like Maria Stewart and Sojourner Truth and these historical examples of folks coming together, well, or provide historical examples of people using this intersectional lens to, in this struggle for freedom and dignity and justice. And then also thinking about the multiracial coalitions that are different examples of solidarity and people joining the struggles across these different intersections to really amplify these calls for change. So.
And for me, I would say I have a couple of resources for you. racialequitytools.org is really great, especially if you're just looking for articles and worksheets, and if you happen to be a DEI manager in your own in your own organization, there's some really great resources there that are free and just that's low-hanging fruit. So I like to tell people about that. Number two, there is a podcast and called Race Capital, and it is full disclosure, done and produced by my sister, who is a political and social activist, but it has a lot of great material, especially around social equity, especially if you're interested in the landscape in Richmond, Virginia, but also nationwide. So that's Race Capital, and it's capital with an O, not an A. So, or CAPITOL is that. And then the last thing that I'll say is mutual aid. If you are really interested in work in intersectionality and equity work, get involved in mutual aid, because with living in the world that we live in and all these biases that have infiltrated state agencies and social welfare initiatives, until those initiatives and those agencies reckon with their own gaps in equity, we as individuals can serve other people in our community. Mutual aid is the process of giving direct money, funds, and support to individuals who are asking for need. And it is a process that is, it's not bound by making sure that person is who they say, or doing exactly what they say they are, and they're going to report back to you and they're going to qualify themselves to you. It's like, no, we want to get rid of those kind of barriers to entry. And if you have the money and you have the grace and the flexibility, and you're okay with sending someone some money and support just because they need it and they say they need it, then do that, because people are asking for what they need and they're not being listened to. And mutual aid is a way of listening to the people closest to you and seeing your impact made real immediately.
Okay, guys, I have a skill for reading quickly, so I'm going to try and smash in as many questions as we can in 9 minutes. So first up, someone asked, interesting to hear the panel on the concept of intersectionality. Can we hear a specific example and the oppression evident from that, i.e. a specific use of the tool? So intersectionality in action.
Yeah, I can kind of speak to that. So I am a Black transgender femme who's non-binary, and you can say I'm a woman, but again, that's the whole other conversation. But so I have 3 separate intersections here that are evident. I'm Black, I'm transgender, and I exist as a feminine person / a woman. And so depending on how people view me, again, separate conversation. And so as a Black trans woman, my community actually experiences fatal violence and are murdered at a much larger, almost 4 times as much as any of our peers. And so we are violated more than just women, more than just Black women and more than just queer people in general. And so what that tells us is if the oppression that faces us cannot be one-for-one traced to just one of our identities, then that means it is a result of our collective identities. And so just living as a Black trans woman who's under the age of 35, I actually have a much higher chance of being hurt very grievously or even unfortunately murdered in our country than cisgender women or queer cisgender people or Black cisgender women. It has more to do with my collection of being Black, queer, and a woman. And so that's one way of looking at how oppression and violence faces the Black trans community versus other communities.
That was a very succinct and also brave answer to use yourself as an example. We care a lot, but we're also the realities on the other end of these analyses and frameworks. And I just wanted to thank you for being so vulnerable. Another anonymous question. Many references are being made to, quote, do the work. We need to do the work. Can a detailed explanation of what work is called for to clarify this? Paul, maybe?
Sure, yeah. And I think Aurora spoke to this in mentioning the different levels of engagement or strategy, or in essence, doing the work, right? Thinking about the personal, the interpersonal, the cultural, and the institutional, and noting that at those different levels, different things are going to be called for, which is why you would there's work that we need to do because we have all been socialized in this hierarchy of human value. We all have, we're breathing the dusty, moldy air of this apartment building that we live in that we inherited, right? So that's got all of our senses. So we have to work through that. There's personal work we can do in addition to the interpersonal work that we can do so that one of the reasons I love the article I mentioned by Audre Lorde is that she gets to the distortion of difference that impacts our relationship. We can't see each other as equals because we think, oh, that's different. And by different, I'm saying that's deviant. That's not the norm. That's other, right? And so the interpersonal allows us to undo some of that. And so those are some examples of the differences in doing the work. But Aurora put it succinctly with personal, interpersonal, cultural, and institutional, and thinking about those levels of analysis and the strategies that we would use at each of them.
Thank you so much. We're going to keep it pushing. Paul, the attendee, asked, hi, thanks for this. I am 63 and not really up to speed with all the different sexuality challenges, pronouns, and social differences. How can I be in tune with intersectionality when I don't know the groupings? Aurora, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, I mean, this is easy and hard to answer at the same time. So bear with me, Paul, the attendee. I hear you, I really do. And I have a lot of, grace for this question. One of the easiest ways I can say, if you just kind of need some boosters, or I assume that you've interacted, but you just need some updating. Maybe just try YouTube and just type in intersectionality or type in gender versus sexuality, and look for things that are vetted, things like TEDx, things like Crash Course in Psychology. All of these things are on and available through YouTube and are really great at packaging really complex. I wish we had more time because that's a whole conversation in and of itself that I also typically do panels and discussions on. But for you, it just sounds like you're just looking for some general direction. And I would say, look at the racial equity tools for some of them, and then YouTube, and look at Crash Course Psychology and TEDx. I mean, just within those two, I'm sure you can find some semi-reputable things that could lead you and get you some ideas of other places to look. But yeah, I think that's the best advice I can give you in this amount of time that we have.
I think those two questions back to back are really awesome. The question of what work is there to do, informing yourself and putting in the concerted effort to provide support and respect to people who may be very, very different from you when just looking at identities. that is a step in the right direction that any of us can take with a simple YouTube search. We can fit in one more question. Nellie asked, how would I recognize that my company would implement intersectionality in their diversity and inclusion training programs? I want to understand the difference with current trainings that large organizations are currently using. I'm asking because I thought I had heard that intersectionality is not really adopted by companies. Also, how does the future look for this subject to be taught in school for our kids' future generations? I think that's kind of two questions. We might have to pick one.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think to clarify, I was saying that companies might not necessarily be engaged in an intersection or using intersectionality in their diversity and inclusion efforts. Because if they're just saying like, oh, it's all about race and everyone is, their race, or it's all about, just gender, right? Then that would be indicative of not using an intersectional lens. I mean, I think you could see this in trainings, but to give another example is thinking about when we look at the numbers, right? A lot of organizations now are doing both internal and external reporting or public reporting on what their diverse workforce looks like or doesn't look like. And in that, they're saying, okay, we're going to look at race, we're going to look at gender, we're going to look at sexual orientation, gender identity, we're going to look at a number of things. And if they're just doing like, we're just going to focus on race, or again, we're just going to focus on gender, then that would be indicative of we're not really thinking intersectionally. And as well as taking that a step further to say like, okay, we see, it's not to say it's not important to do that level of analysis, but go a step deeper and saying like, okay, so what does pay look like, not just for Black people as a whole, but Black men, Black women, Latinx men and Latinx women, right? Like, and along other aspects of our identity as well, and going down deeper into that level of analysis. So that would give you an indication as to whether we're taking an intersectional approach or not.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us today. There were a slew of amazing questions. If we didn't ask your question live, I'm really sorry. We just couldn't get to them all. Thank you for participating and engaging. Thank you so much to Aurora and Paul for your time and sharing your insights with us. And thank you to the Rise Journey for partnering with us on this event. It has really meant a lot and I hope made an impact. Before we go, I'd like to share a few slides if you don't mind. For others who find others who share your interest, you can save 30% on your first subscription. Go to meetupsavings.com. You can have conversations similar to these with people in your area or at virtual events or on any topic that you find as interesting. Also, we've launched our podcast, Keep Connected with Meetup CEO earlier this year. Please take a moment, take out your phone, and you can scan this QR code. So if you're not watching on your phone, you can open your camera, you can hold it right up to this QR code. It'll bring you straight to the Keep Connected podcast, where we are having all sorts of interesting conversations about community and connection, and you might find something interesting there as well. As a reminder, you can view a recap of this event in a few days on our Community Matters blog at meetup.com/blog. Thanks again for joining us and stay safe, everyone. Have a great night.